We are continuing today, Mesillas Hashem, in Parak Yotes and Mesillas Yesharim. So we're continuing in the Midah of Chasidus. So if you remember again, at the beginning of the chapter, the Ramchal broke up Chasidus into three components: Maisa, Ofen Ha'asiyah, and Kavana. The first aspect being, we'll call it the actional, bein adam lamakom, bein adam lechavera, how one performs mitzvos. And the second part is ofen ha'asiyah, the manner in which it is performed. That's the section that we begin now. Hachelek hashini min ha'chasidus hu ba'ofen ha'asiyah. The second component of chasidus is what we call ofen ha'asiyah, the manner in which one performs their spiritual service. V'hine gam ze nichlal b'shnei inyonim. This also has two components. Now, when he says two components, it means you could break it up. Bein adam lamakom, man's relationship with Hashem. Bein adam lechavero, man's relationship with his fellow man. But within each of these categories, there are many other subcategories. The first two primary aspects or categories to look at are hayira v'ha'ava. Literally, again, love, and yira is ava's love. Yira is often translated as fear, but the truth is we're going to better use the word reverence or awe. Shnei amudei ha'avod ha'amita shezulasim lo tikon klal. In the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ultimately, again, yira and ava are the two necessary components, without which one is deficient in their service of the Ribbon Shalom. So let's analyze. Bichlala yira. What does it mean, yira? See, he explains, Yesh hachna milafanav yisparach. There ultimately, again, is a humbling of oneself before Hashem. Haboshes bikrav alavadaso, a certain sense of embarrassment that I know that I could be doing more, but I'm not operating on all cylinders. Va'kavan hanasam tzosaf al shemo yisparach. And there's a reverence, there's an awe, there's a respect with which I approach my service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ve'al Toraso. So again, it's interesting how it defines yira. So yira, number one, is humility. It's a certain level of embarrassment of approaching God because I recognize I'm not living up to my full potential. And it's a reverence in the way that I perform mitzvos, in the way that I serve Hashem, in the way that I learn Torah, because I recognize that I'm doing something incredibly special. That's yira, kind of like in a panoramic view. What does it mean to love Hashem? Simcha, dveikos, kina, va'atanavarim echad echad. So there's simcha, joy, dveikos, which means a sense of clinging. Now, kina is interesting. We normally translate kina as jealousy. We'll see what that means in a little bit. Now, says Ramchal, let's analyze each of these categories one by one. Ramchal explains, Hine, ikar hayira, hiras haramimus. The real aspect of yira is a reverence or an awe that is engendered through a recognition of the greatness of Hashem. When a person davens and a person does mitzvahs, he has to think about, before whom am I standing? Before whom am I davening? As the Gemara Mesillas Yesharim says, when you daven, do lifnei mi atam mispalo. Know before whom you are davening. So the first aspect of yira, says the Ramchal, is what he calls really a reverence, yiras haromimus, which is a cognition, a recognition, understanding that when I daven, that when I do mitzvos, who am I doing mitzvos for? Who am I davening in front of? Who am I serving? A recognition of the fact that I stand before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that by itself engenders what he calls the yiras haromimus, a reverence. Person has to contemplate three things in order to get to what the Ramchal calls this yiras haromimus, this reverence or recognition of the greatness of the God before whom I stand. So number one, he says, good. Who omed mamish lifnei Baruch Yisbarach Shemo, v'nosei imo, afapi she'ein adam ro'ehu. So this is incredible. So the first thing, and this is really what we're going to focus on for the rest of the shiur, is a person has to recognize that he literally stands before Hashem. In other words, sometimes you think about this idea like, when I daven, I speak to Hashem, or I do mitzvahs in the presence of Hashem, and we think about it like as a metaphorical statement. The Ramchal says it's not metaphorical. It's literal. Shu omed mamish lifnei Baruch Yisbarach Shemo. I'm literally standing in front of Hashem, and I'm literally dialoguing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even though no one else could see. Even though I can't see him. The Sirah, The truth is, Ramchal says, this is the hardest thing for a person to imagine. Why? Because I can't rely on any of my senses. Now, this is actually a pretty incredible idea, because in our Chasidus Chabura, where we're learning B'nai Machshava Tova, the Sefer of the Piazetzna, the Piazetzna spends an entire Sefer describing this entire dynamic of how to really feel the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How do I really feel the presence of God? I know that I stand before God, but how do I feel it? And Ramchal acknowledges that this is one of the hardest things in Yiddishkeit. Isn't it fascinating? In other words, we all say it. I know that I'm in the presence of God. I know that I daven in the presence of God. I know that I learn Torah. I do mitzvah. But do I actually feel it? Do I actually feel that I am in His presence? And then Ramchal says, this is the first step of Yira, to truly recognize and understand that ultimately, again, I'm omeid mamish lifnei habor yisbarach. I'm literally standing before God. But it's hard to understand and it's hard to imagine, because I can't really use any of my senses. Amnam, mishu bal seichel nachon, bim'at isbonenus v'simas leiv, yuchal likboa b'libo amitas hadavar. Ramchal says, however, someone who is what he calls a bal seichel nachon. A bal seichel nachon is a thoughtful person with a little bit of contemplation and a little bit simas leiv. Simas leiv means attentiveness. So ultimately, again, could come to this truth, could come to this feeling. The recognition that I'm literally dialoguing with God when I daven. And literally I'm supplicating before Him. And whatever I request, I'm requesting directly from Him. And Hashem listens to me. Just as one person listens to another person. So the Ramchal essentially, so just kind of to trace this back. So now we're focusing over here on the second chelik of Chasidus, which is the Ofen HaAsiyah, how we perform mitzvos. In this realm, says the Ramchal, in our Bin Adam L'Makom, we break this down into two components, Ava and Yira. So again, we're focusing now on Yira. What's the first part of Yira? The first part of Yira is Yiras Haromimos, a recognition of the greatness of God. Step one in the greatness of the recognition of God, the Ramchal says, is that a person has to understand that he's omeid mamish. It's not a metaphor, it's not an expression. I'm literally in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now the truth is, I'm in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu all the time. But at least to recognize in the beginning, I'm in the presence of Hashem when I daven. I'm in the presence of Hashem when I do mitzvahs, when I learn Torah, when I do chesed. The Ramchal says, but how do I get to that recognition? How do I get to that feeling? After all, again, I can't see God. I can't feel God. So how do I get to it? And the Ramchal says something amazing. The Ramchal says it's easy. Maybe it's easy for the Ramchal. I don't know that it's... But whether it's easy or not, it's attainable. The Ramchal says, therefore, what do you need? Bal seichel nachon. So you have to go ahead, first of all, and be a thoughtful person. So am I willing to... Which by the way, is not such a pashut thing. Because the truth is, in many respects, we've stopped being thoughtful people. Because as soon as we have a moment free, we don't think. Usually we just take out a device, in the name of work. We're checking this, sending this, doing that, which is, maybe it has, boosted our career productivity. But it's totally taken away the ability just to be thoughtful people in a meaningful way. Ramchal says, so step number one is I have to be a thoughtful person. Then step two, his boninus. I have to take time to really contemplate this with simas leiv. So it's seichel nachon, his boninus, simas leiv. Be a thoughtful person. Then carve out some time for contemplation. And then make sure during that time for contemplation, simas leiv, you're attentive to that contemplation. And the Ramchal says, if I do that, I will come to this recognition. I'll come to this understanding. I will come to feel that I'm truly omeid mamish lifnei habor yisbarach shemo, that I'm truly standing before Hashem. And this, says the Ramchal, is the first step in acquiring Yira. All right, we'll stop over here for today. Wishing everyone a wonderful day. Will Amir Hashem continue in this beautiful journey tomorrow.